Now, if we want to track and figure out what's going on with a particular disorder, we can do that using a pedigree. This does not require fancy testing. This is not something that requires a lot of money. You just go through and say, let's set up some ground rules. So typically what you're going to do is say females are going to be the round ones. I didn't make this up, so don't yell at me. Males are going to be the square ones. And you're going to decide on some color as being affected. Usually that just means it's colored in. So usually it's black if you're doing black and white. Although in this case you can say red is the one that's affected. And so everybody that has the trait in question, you color in. So you can decide which one's going to be colored in. You could say freckles is what's colored in. You could say no freckles, whatever, but you let us know. You would detail that. So for this one, we could always say it's going to be freckles. All right? And so you would say everybody with freckles now is going to be colored in, and we can observe this. This is a phenotype, so it's not like this is difficult. So we then go through and track our ancestors, and we set it up where when you see a line like this, it means that these were two individuals that mated, and then everybody that's connected with a line, these are their offspring. And then you can see some of the offspring then mate with other individuals, and then you're just going to go through and track their children. So the line comes down to show us it's their kids, branches off to show us they had 4 kids in this case, on and on. You'll oftentimes too see that they'll use Roman numerals to delineate generations. So we'll have our first generation, second generation, third generation. And ideally a pedigree tries to go at least 3 generations. That gives us the best data. What we can then do is use the pedigree to try to figure out, is this trait dominant or recessive? If it's dominant, it should never skip a generation. Let me say that again. It should never skip a generation. So what I mean by that is you should always have, when someone's affected, an offspring, at least one parent should also be affected. So we have affected offspring, 3 out of 5 here, and we also have an affected father or parent. We then go down and we see an affected parent, affected child. We see no affected parents, no affected children. So based upon this consistent pattern, this particular pedigree is very likely dominant. I can't promise it's not recessives, because recessives can also not skip generations, but if you look far enough, you should see them skip a generation. That's one of the ways we diagnose this. So for instance, this other pedigree over here, you'll see that the parents did not have the trait, but one of the offspring did. So right away, just looking at it straight off like that, I can say that this is going to be a recessive trait. And so this will be one of the ways that we can analyze things. Now we're going to come back to pedigrees later when we talk about things that have to do with gender, but for now we're just going to look at pedigrees in terms of dominant versus recessive. Once we know things are dominant versus recessive, we can do some further analysis. So let's do some further analysis. What we can do then is look at this and say, if these 2 individuals manage to have an affected child, not only is this trait recessive, but each of these individuals must have been a carrier, because otherwise they could not have an affected child, because if it's a recessive trait, the only way to have the trait is to be homozygous recessive. So I now know the genotype of this affected individual, little a, and I obviously know the genotype of every other affected individual. And then we can go through and say, well, for this particular person here, these guys both must be heterozygotes because some of their children are affected. And so I can go through and start crunching the numbers here. I can start to kind of figure things out, working my way back. This individual must be little a. This individual must be little a. I know these 2 individuals must be heterozygotes because one of their parents was affected. Because they're affected, they have to pass on a little a. So because they're healthy, they must have gotten one big A, but the other one must be a little a. So you can start to see, I hope, that you can piece together most individuals' genotypes, although there will be some particular cases where we can't. So this person must be a heterozygote because an offspring had to get a little a from both parents, otherwise they can't have a recessive trait. But there are some individuals where I wouldn't know for sure, like this guy. I don't know for sure if he's big A little a or big A big A. And so we sometimes just write that as A and then a line because we're not sure, or sometimes they'll put a question mark to show that we're not positive. We know it's got the one big A, but we don't know what that other one is. Now, if we could track this individual and see who they marry and how many kids they have and what their traits are, we could probably figure it out later on. This individual we know because this parent must passed on a little a, so you can kind of work your way through here, but I don't know for sure if this person's this, what they have here, because they could be big A, or they could be big A little a. So it's not perfect, we don't know everything, but we can figure out quite a bit. And based upon that too, if we know the genotypes of individuals, we could start to figure out what their odds are if they have kids of having the trait. So if we allow a little bit of inbreeding here, just because it's convenient, if this male were to reproduce with this female, we could then set up essentially a Punnett square, big A, little a, little a, little a, and we could crunch the numbers and say, all right, if you were to have kids, there is a 50% chance that they would be healthy but carriers, and there's a 50% chance that they would have whatever that trait is. So if this was something negative, we would know that there's about a 50-50 chance that our child could be affected. And we can use this to try to decide, do we want to have children? You know, for some couples, if they have a disorder in their family, they might decide that it's worth it just to let the disorder die with them at the cost of not having kids. So this arms you with that knowledge.